lost.
To a primitive world? How? We invaded Earth, and Earth invaded us back, because humans don't fight to win. They fight to make sure you lose.
Smoke still clung to the general's ruined armor, a pungent mix of burnt copper, ozone, and dried mud. He stood before the galaxy's most powerful beings, visibly trembling. He hadn't come to boast of a newly conquered world. He had come to warn them. He had come to beg. The Galactic Council chamber smelled overwhelmingly of sterilized air and old stone. It was a massive, vaulted amphitheater designed to make the individual feel incredibly small. And in Simon's case, it was working perfectly. He sat in the observer's gallery, a narrow sliver of seating suspended above the main floor, his synthetic suit jacket chafing against the back of his sweat-dampened neck. The translation earpiece wedged into his left ear hummed with a low, constant static, a faint D-flat that had been giving him a slow-building migraine for the better part of 3 hours. Simon wasn't a hero. He wasn't a decorated general or a brilliant tactician. He was a junior attaché for the Terran Diplomatic Corps, a glorified clerk who had drawn the short straw and been sent to this bureaucratic purgatory to monitor the proceedings. Earth hadn't even officially been inducted into the Council yet. They were a footnote, a backwater, primitive species, still relying on crude combustion engines and localized agricultural networks. Or at least, that was the official classification on the Council's databanks. Down on the main floor, the heavy platinum doors hissed open, the hydraulic seals releasing a sharp sigh that echoed into the cavernous ceiling. General Thomas walked in. Or, more accurately, he dragged himself in. Simon leaned forward, gripping the edge of the smooth, cold polysilicate railing. The earpiece's translation matrix had assigned the alien a heavily traditional Western name, trying to map his rank, status, and cultural equivalent into a human understanding. Thomas was a warlord of the Vanguard Coalition. His species were towering, broad-shouldered bipeds with hardened, chitinous skin and an arrogant, upright posture that usually commanded instant submission. They were the muscle of the Council, the enforcers. But Thomas was not upright. He was hunched, his usually pristine, bone-white ceremonial armor scorched and heavily dented. Entire plates were missing from his left flank, exposing the bruised, leathery purple flesh beneath. One of his forearms ended in a mess of cauterized scar tissue just below the elbow. As he limped toward the central podium, his heavy boots scuffed against the polished floor, leaving a faint trail of gray dust. He smelled of ash. Even from 30 feet up in the gallery, Simon could catch the faint, acrid scent of a world that had been set on fire. It cut through the sterile, lemon-scented air purifiers of the chamber like a rusted blade. At the highest tier of the room, Counselor Richard peered down through spectacles that caught the harsh, white glare of the overhead lighting. Richard was tall, spindly, and draped in heavy, velvet-like fabrics that rustled dryly every time he shifted his weight. He was a creature of immense age and even greater impatience. "General Thomas," Richard's voice boomed, synthesized and amplified through the chamber's acoustic dampeners. It was a smooth, resonant baritone, masking the natural clicking of his mandibles. "You are late. The Council expected your debriefing on the pacification of Sector 4 days ago." Thomas stopped at the podium. He did not salute. He did not perform the customary bowing of the primary neck. He simply gripped the edges of the metal stand with his remaining 3 hands, his knuckles turning a pale, sickly yellow as they strained against the material. "I am late," Thomas said. His voice was a wet, ragged rasp. It sounded like 2 grindstones rubbing together without lubrication, because I had to wait for the fires on my flagship to be extinguished before I could break orbit. A low murmur rippled through the tiered seating of the chamber. Dozens of species, represented by hundreds of delegates, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Vanguard Coalition did not suffer fires on their flagships. They did not suffer delays. They were a military machine optimized over thousands of years to conquer, occupy, and integrate lesser species within a standard galactic solar month. Counselor Margaret leaned forward, her heavy metallic jewelry clinking loudly against her collarbone. "A minor rebellion, General? Surely the orbital bombardment pacified the local population. You were deployed to the Sol system, were you not? A Class II civilization." ununified, technologically stagnant. We deployed to the third planet, Thomas said, his gaze fixed firmly on the polished floor beneath him, as if unable to meet the eyes of his superiors. The one the locals call Earth. And, Richard pressed, his tone dripping with bored condescension, is the pacification complete? Have the resource extraction quotas been established? Simon swallowed hard. His mouth was completely dry, tasting of stale coffee and raw anxiety. He knew the Vanguard Coalition had set their sights on Earth. Everyone in the diplomatic corps knew. It was why Simon was here to watch the bureaucratic rubber stamping of his home world's enslavement, unable to do anything but document the legal precedent. Earth's military didn't have a unified command. They didn't have plasma shielding or kinetic barriers. They had guns that fired little pieces of lead and planes that required atmospheric lift. It was supposed to be a massacre. Thomas slowly raised his head. His dark, multifaceted eyes looked dull, stripped of the glossy sheen that usually marked his kind's vitality. "We invaded Earth," Thomas said, the translation matrix struggling to capture the sheer depth of the exhaustion in his voice. He paused, a long, agonizing silence stretching across the immense room. The only sound was the hum of the air recyclers and the faint, panicked thumping of Simon's own heart. "And we have lost." The chamber didn't erupt into chaos. It didn't explode into shouting. Instead, it was consumed by a sudden, suffocating vacuum of silence. It was the shock of a fundamental law of physics being casually broken in front of a room full of scientists. It was a statement so profoundly absurd that the council simply could not process it. "Lost," Richard repeated, the word rolling around in his mouth as if it were a foreign object. He chuckled, a dry, clicking sound that lacked any real humor. "General, are you experiencing atmospheric trauma? The Vanguard does not lose to Class II primitives. Did they hire mercenaries? Did a rogue faction intervene?" "No one intervened," Thomas whispered. He let go of the podium and reached up with a trembling hand, tracing the ruined, melted edge of his breastplate. "It was just them, just the humans." "Impossible," Margaret snapped, her patience evaporating. She slammed a slender, multi-jointed hand against her desk. "You commanded 300 capital ships. You had a ground force of 2 million heavily armored shock troops. They do not even possess a unified planetary defense grid." "That," Thomas said, his voice suddenly spiking with a frantic, desperate energy, "was our first mistake. We planned to strike their central command. We planned to decapitate their leadership, fracture their morale, and accept the surrender of their global government." He let out a sound that was half sob, half cough. It was an ugly, wet noise that made Simon's stomach twist. "Counselor." Thomas looked up, his eyes wide and haunted. "They don't have a global government. They have borders. Imaginary lines drawn in the dirt, guarded with a ferocity that defies all logic. When we destroyed their capital cities, they didn't surrender. They didn't capitulate." Thomas shuddered, his heavy frame trembling violently. "They got angry." Simon felt a cold bead of sweat slowly trace its way down his spine, soaking into the cotton of his shirt. He knew exactly what Thomas was talking about. The council operated on logic. When a superior force arrived, the inferior force calculated the odds of survival, realized resistance meant extinction, and surrendered. It was basic mathematics. It was biological preservation. But humans didn't do math when they were cornered. "Explain yourself, General," Richard demanded, the earlier amusement entirely gone from his voice. The air in the room was shifting. Simon could smell it, a faint, sour odor like crushed mint and spoiled milk. The alien delegates were secreting stress pheromones. The impossible was taking shape in their minds, and it terrified them. "We made landfall in a region they call Eastern Europe," Thomas continued, his gaze distant, staring through the podium, through the floor, looking at something 1,000 light-years away. "Our planetary analysts selected it for its wide plains, optimal for our mechanized walkers. We expected a conventional engagement, a clash of armies." Thomas closed his eyes. The ridges along his jawline twitched. "The mud," he whispered, You don't understand the texture of it. Our sensors told us it was just saturated soil, but it clung to everything. It clogged the thermal intakes of the siege walkers. It froze at night, turning our treads into useless blocks of stone, and during the day it melted into a thick, sucking rot that swallowed our infantry up to their knees. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Environmental hazards are standard in planetary pacification. You deploy the engineers, you pave the terrain, you advance. We tried, Thomas shot back, his voice rising in an unstable crescendo. But the humans didn't engage us in the open. They didn't line up their forces. They waited until we were bogged down in the filth. And then they sent the civilians. A murmur of confusion spread through the room. Civilians? Counselor Henry, a stout, heavily armored delegate from the inner rings, leaned into his microphone. You mean conscripts? Poorly armed militia? No, Thomas said softly. I mean civilians. Farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers. They didn't wear uniforms. We couldn't tell who was a combatant and who was a bystander. We adhered to the galactic rules of engagement. We did not fire on unarmed populace centers. We broadcasted terms of peace. Thomas let out a bitter, hollow laugh. The sound sent a shiver down Simon's arms. Do you know what they did to our peace envoys? A human male, perhaps 60 of their solar years old, drove a primitive agricultural vehicle, a tractor, directly into the center of our forward operating base. He waved a white flag. He was smiling. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively. When our troops approached to accept his surrender, the vehicle detonated. He had packed it with 3 tons of synthetic fertilizer and diesel fuel. He vaporized himself and half of my command staff. The silence in the council chamber was absolute. It was thick and heavy, like wet wool. Simon closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. Yeah, he thought. That sounds like us. He wasn't proud of it. He didn't feel a surge of patriotic triumph. He just felt deeply, profoundly tired. He knew human history. He knew the ugly, jagged edges of his own species. We were a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other over scraps of land and ideological differences. The Vanguard Coalition had walked into a meat grinder, expecting a civilized duel. A suicide tactic, Richard said, his tone wavering, struggling to maintain his posture of absolute authority. Desperate, but ultimately ineffective, against a sustained campaign. It wasn't just one, Thomas corrected heavily. It was all of them. It was the entire species. There was no logic to it. They weaponized their own infrastructure against us. He gripped the podium tighter, leaning in. He wanted the council to understand. He needed them to understand the nightmare he had crawled out of. We took a major industrial hub, a city built on a river. We set up our garrison expecting to use their factories to repair our armor. On the 3rd night, the river caught fire. Water does not burn, General. Margaret stated coldly. They dumped millions of gallons of crude, unrefined oil into the current upriver, Thomas countered, his voice cracking, the raw emotion finally bleeding through the translation matrix. And they ignited it. The entire river turned into a ribbon of screaming flame right through the center of our camp. The smoke, it was thick, black, choking tar. Our atmospheric filters failed. My soldiers suffocated in their sleep, their lungs coated in soot, while the humans shot at anyone who tried to run from the flames. Thomas looked up at the tiered seating, his multifaceted eyes wide and begging. They destroyed their own city. They poisoned their own water supply, just to force us out. What kind of species does that? What kind of creature destroys its own nest just to kill the insect that crawled inside? Simon watched the alien delegates. They were shifting, whispering to each other, their movements jerky and anxious. They were creatures of order. They built grand, sweeping civilizations based on cooperation, logic, and mutual benefit. They fought wars with strict rules, minimizing structural damage to preserve the value of the conquered planet. They couldn't comprehend a species motivated by pure, unadulterated spite. It is deeply illogical, Counselor Henry muttered, tapping his armored fingers against his desk. Such tactics ensure their own eventual starvation. It is mutual destruction. They don't care. Thomas suddenly roared, the sound echoing violently off the vaulted ceiling. He slammed his one good fist onto the podium. The sharp crack made several delegates jump. Don't you understand? They do not care if they survive. They only care that we die with them. Thomas stood there, chest heaving, the exertion pulling at his wounds. A drop of dark, viscous fluid leaked from the bandages beneath his armor and hit the floor with a soft pat. They are not fighting to preserve their world. Thomas lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. They are fighting to drag us into hell with them, and they are exceptionally good at it. The chamber felt noticeably colder now. The lemon scent of the floor wax was entirely masked by the thick, metallic tang of alien fear. Simon rubbed his temples. The earpiece's D-flat hum seemed louder, pressing against his eardrums. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. He remembered the smell of rain on hot asphalt back in Chicago. He remembered the loud, chaotic, aggressive energy of a simple subway ride. Humans were abrasive. They were loud, territorial, and fiercely independent. Put 100 humans in a room, and you'd have a dozen different arguments within an hour. But threaten them all with an outside force? The lines of division vanished. The arguments stopped. They locked arms, not out of love for one another, but out of a shared, burning hatred for the trespasser. You speak of localized resistance, Richard said, though his voice had lost its thunder. It sounded thin, stretched tight over a growing panic. Surely your orbital assets maintained supremacy. The sky belonged to you. The sky. Thomas laughed, a miserable, broken sound that lacked any joy. Yes, we owned the sky, and they knew it, so they went underground. Thomas activated a small holographic projector on the podium. A flickering, blue-tinted image materialized in the air above him. It showed a sprawling human metropolis, half-ruined, reduced to jagged concrete teeth jutting into a gray sky. This is a city they called New York, Thomas said, the translation matrix mangling the pronunciation slightly. We leveled the surface. We turned their glass towers into silica dust. Our sensors showed 0 biological life signs above ground. We sent down 3 battalions of our best heavy infantry to secure the ruins. The hologram shifted, diving down below the surface, rendering a chaotic, sprawling web of tunnels. Subways? Simon breathed quietly to himself. Sewers. Maintenance shafts. Beneath the city, Thomas continued, his voice trembling again. A labyrinth of concrete and steel. Millions of miles of tunnels. The humans retreated into the dark. They hid from our thermal scans by wrapping themselves in thermal reflective emergency blankets, pieces of foil that cost fractions of a credit. They defeated our multi-billion credit sensor arrays with trash. Thomas gestured to the hologram. When our troops entered the ruins, the ground swallowed them. The humans had rigged the surface streets with explosive charges. Entire city blocks collapsed into the tunnels, burying our soldiers alive. And those who survived the fall. Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment, the battle-hardened warlord looked entirely fragile. He looked like a frightened child. The humans didn't use plasma, Thomas whispered into the silent room. Plasma cauterizes. It kills instantly. They used kinetic accelerators, bullets, shrapnel, jagged pieces of metal designed to tear flesh, to shatter bone, to cause maximum agony. They hid in the dark, in the filth of their own waste systems, and they hunted my men. We couldn't use our heavy weapons in the enclosed spaces without collapsing the tunnels on ourselves. We had to fight them hand to hand. Counselor Margaret's face was completely drained of color. Hand to hand with a Class II species? You have a massive biological advantage in strength and durability, General. Durability doesn't matter when they don't fight fair, Thomas snapped. They set traps. They strung monomolecular wire across the dark corridors at neck height. They left out food rations laced with heavy metals and neurotoxins, knowing our supply lines were stretched and our troops were hungry. They used acoustic weapons, speakers blasting, agonizing, high-frequency noise into the tunnels day and night, so my soldiers couldn't sleep. My men began to hallucinate. They began to fire on each other in the dark. Thomas looked up at Margaret, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. They broke us, counselor. Not tactically, psychologically. They eroded our sanity. Simon shifted in his uncomfortable chair, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He could picture it. The absolute, terrifying ingenuity of a species that had nothing left to lose. The Vanguard Coalition fought wars like a gentleman's duel. Humans fought wars like a cornered rat. And the ultimate insult, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly hum. The absolute pinnacle of their madness. We captured a group of them, a squad of resistance fighters, young males and females. We interrogated them. We asked them who their commander was. We asked them what their grand strategy was. We assumed they were part of a massive, coordinated military structure. Thomas paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with the various delegates who were now leaning forward in morbid fascination. They laughed at us, Thomas said. They sat there, bleeding, broken, facing execution, and they laughed. One of them told me they didn't have a commander. They weren't soldiers. They were, and I am relying on the translation matrix here, they were plumbers, baristas, and accountants. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. To the highly specialized, caste-based societies of the council, the idea of a civilian fighting and defeating a professional soldier was abhorrent. It violated the natural order of the universe. I asked them why they didn't surrender. Thomas continued softly. I told them we had occupied their major cities. I told them we controlled their orbit. I told them it was statistically impossible for them to win. And what did they say? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked down at his missing arm, touching the scarred stump. The human looked me in the eye, Thomas said, and he said, "We know we can't win, but we're going to make sure losing costs you everything." Thomas looked back up at the council, the fire dying out of his eyes, leaving only a hollow, burned-out shell of a general. "We lost 40% of our ground forces in the first 3 weeks," Thomas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, simply reporting the devastating facts. Not in open combat, in ambushes, from poisoned water, from booby-trapped infrastructure. My soldiers refused to deploy. Mutiny spread through the fleet. The Vanguard Coalition, undefeated for 3 millennia, broke because my men were too terrified to set foot on that mud ball. He slowly pushed himself away from the podium. I ordered a full retreat. I abandoned our forward bases. We left our dead in the mud because the humans had begun mining the corpses. At that, Counselor Henry, visibly wretched, turning his head away from the floor. Margaret raised a hand to her mouth in horror. The use of the dead as a weapon was a taboo so profound it was almost unspeakable in galactic society. Simon closed his eyes. Yeah, he thought, that's us. Ugly, brutal, and utterly uncompromising. He felt a strange mixture of horror and relief. Earth was safe, not because they were strong enough to defend themselves, but because they were too completely unhinged to be worth the effort. "General Thomas," Richard said, his voice shaking. He adjusted his spectacles, though his hands trembled so badly he nearly knocked them off his face. "You are telling this council that a Class II, ununified, primitive species defeated the greatest military armada in the known galaxy using spite?" "I am telling this council," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent chamber, "that we did not invade a world of rational beings. We invaded an asylum. We kicked a hive of predatory insects that would gladly burn their own hive to the ground just to ensure we burned with it." Thomas turned away from the podium, his posture slumped, the gray dust falling from his boots. He stopped and looked over his shoulder at the stunned, silent delegates. "Quarantine that system," Thomas warned, his voice a grim, fatalistic prophecy. "Do not try to trade with them. Do not try to subjugate them. Do not even look at them. Put a warning buoy on the edge of their system and pray to whatever gods you hold dear that they never figure out how to build hyperdrives." As Thomas limped out of the chamber, the heavy platinum doors hissing shut behind him, the Galactic Council remained frozen in absolute, terrified silence. Up in the gallery, Simon sat in his uncomfortable chair, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and finally smiled. The heavy platinum doors remained shut. The hissing seal had long since engaged, locking the Galactic Council back inside their sterile, lemon-scented vault. But the ghost of General Thomas seemed to linger in the center of the room. The smell of his scorched armor, that bitter, choking blend of ozone and ash, refused to dissipate. Up in the observer's gallery, Simon slowly exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for an hour. His lungs burned. His hands, resting on his lap, were trembling so violently he had to interlock his fingers to force them still. He wanted a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in 5 years, having kicked the habit during his grueling orbital training. But right now, the craving hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wanted the harsh, burning scrape of cheap tobacco against his throat. He wanted something familiar. Down on the floor, the paralysis finally broke. It didn't shatter into screaming or chaos, but into a low, terrifying hum of panicked whispers. The alien delegates leaned toward one another, their various appendages twitching, their mandibles clicking, their smooth skin flushing with bioluminescent stress patterns. The translation earpiece in Simon's ear whined, struggling to process 100 hushed conversations at once. It sounded like a nest of angry hornets trapped inside a tin can. We won, Simon thought. The realization didn't feel like victory. It felt like walking away from a car crash with a bloody nose, while the other driver burned alive. He felt a sickening cocktail of profound relief and deep, creeping shame. We didn't outsmart them. We didn't out-tech them. We just dragged them down into the mud and beat them to death with our own severed limbs. Counselor Richards struck his desk. The sound was electronically amplified, a sharp, deafening crack that cut through the hornet nest hum of the room. Order, Richard's synthesized baritone echoed. It lacked its previous unwavering authority. The edges of the word frayed, betraying a frantic underlying vibration. This chamber will come to order. The whispering died down, but the air remained thick with secreted pheromones, sour, metallic, and heavy. We are faced with an unprecedented geopolitical anomaly, Richard continued, adjusting his velvet-like robes. He was trying to rebuild his crumbling wall of bureaucratic detachment. The Vanguard Coalition has failed to secure a Class II world. The strategic implications are that we have a rabid predator gnawing at the edge of civilized space. Counselor Margaret interrupted. She didn't bother waiting for recognition. Her multi-jointed fingers dug into the polished surface of her desk. General Thomas just told us they mine their own dead. They poison their own water. This is not a civilization. It is a biological hazard. A hazard that is currently confined to its own gravity well, Counselor Henry countered, his stout, armored chest heaving. They lack hyperlane technology. They are of no immediate threat to the core worlds. They defeated the Vanguard. Margaret hissed, her eyes wide and black. How long do you think it will take a species that deranged to reverse engineer the wreckage Thomas left behind? 5 of their years? 10? What happens when they figure out how to strap their crude explosives to a faster-than-light drive and aim it at our capitals out of sheer, unadulterated spite? A fresh wave of terror washed over the delegates. Simon swallowed hard. The dry click in his throat sounded deafening in his own ears. Margaret wasn't wrong. If there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was taking a new discovery and immediately figuring out how to kill someone with it. Containment, Richard said loudly, forcing the room back into focus. General Thomas recommended a quarantine. We isolate the Sol system. We deploy a network of automated sentinel buoys. Any vessel attempting to leave their atmosphere is vaporized by orbital lasers. No negotiations. No contact. And who will pay for this blockade? Henry demanded. The Coalition's fleet is decimated. The logistical cost of maintaining a permanent, heavily armed perimeter around a hostile system. Perhaps, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. We should ask the human. The silence that followed was absolute. Simon stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face, pooling cold and heavy in his stomach. Down on the floor, Margaret raised a slender arm and pointed a single, impossibly long finger up toward the observer's gallery. We have a representative of the asylum sitting right here, she said. Hundreds of heads turned. Hundreds of eyes, multifaceted, bioluminescent, slit-pupiled, and pitch black, locked onto Simon. The physical weight of their collective stare made his skin crawl. He suddenly felt hyper-aware of his own body. He felt the cheap synthetic fabric of his suit. He smelled his own stale sweat. He was a junior attaché. He was supposed to take notes, compile a report, and send it back to a bureaucratic black hole in Geneva. Representative Simon. Richard's voice boomed, directed entirely at him. Simon tried to speak. His vocal cords refused to engage. He cleared his throat, a pathetic, rasping sound. "Descend to the floor," Richard commanded. "The council requires testimony." The walk down the spiraling metal staircase took an eternity. Simon's knees felt like they were made of damp sand. Every step was a battle against his own biology, his fight-or-flight response screaming at him to turn around, find a maintenance hatch, and hide. But there was nowhere to hide. He was light years from home, entirely alone, in a room full of gods who had just realized they could bleed. He stepped onto the main floor. The polished polysilicate surface was slippery under the cheap rubber soles of his dress shoes. They squeaked faintly with every step. Squeak, squeak. It was an absurd, undignified sound. It stripped away whatever illusion of menace the council might have projected onto him. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like an exhausted, underpaid accountant suffering from a hangover. He reached the central podium. He didn't touch it. He could see the dent where Thomas had slammed his heavy fist. He could see the tiny, smeared drop of dark alien blood on the metal. The smell of ash was overpowering here. Simon looked up. The tier upon tier of delegates loomed over him. The lighting was harsh, designed to illuminate the speaker for everyone to see, casting deep, unflattering shadows under Simon's eyes. "Is it true?" Richard asked. The towering alien leaned over his desk, his spectacles catching the glare. "Did the Vanguard warlord speak the truth of your people? Or was he attempting to mask his own tactical incompetence behind exaggerations?" Simon gripped the edge of the podium. The metal was still faintly warm. He thought about the diplomatic protocols he had memorized. He thought about the careful, measured language of de-escalation. Lie, deflect, reassure them that humanity is peaceful, that the war was a terrible misunderstanding. He opened his mouth. "He didn't exaggerate," Simon said. His voice sounded small in the massive amphitheater, but it carried. He didn't shout. He didn't try to sound intimidating. He just sounded utterly, deeply tired. "If anything," Simon continued, his gaze drifting to the floor, "he left out the worst parts." A quiet gasp rippled through the front row of delegates. "Explain," Margaret demanded, her voice tight, with thinly veiled disgust. Simon looked up, meeting her dark, bottomless eyes. "You don't understand us because you operate on a baseline of preservation. You build, you maintain, you calculate." Simon paused, wetting his dry lips. "Humans operate on a baseline of mutually assured destruction." He looked around the room, letting his eyes sweep over the terrified, magnificent creatures that ruled the galaxy. "Before you ever showed up," Simon said, his voice gaining a fraction of steadiness, "we had enough nuclear weapons sitting in underground silos to glass our own planet a dozen times over. We built weapons that could end our entire species, and we pointed them at ourselves, just to feel safe, just to make sure that if one of us lost, everyone lost." He let out a short, hollow breath. "You invaded a world that has spent 10,000 years practicing how to end the world. We are paranoid, we are vicious, and we hold grudges for centuries." Counselor Henry leaned forward, his heavy armor clanking. "This is madness. A species cannot survive its own infancy with such a psychological profile." "We barely did," Simon admitted, the raw truth of it scraping against his throat. "We are a walking contradiction. We will cross a freezing ocean to save a stranded whale, and then we will burn a city to the ground because someone prayed to the wrong god. You expected a rational enemy. But we aren't rational. When we are pushed to the edge, we don't calculate the odds of survival. We calculate the cost of revenge." Simon looked up at Richard. The Grand Counselor seemed to shrink back slightly into his velvet robes. "General Thomas was right," Simon said softly. "You need to leave us alone. Quarantine the system. Put up your warning buoys. Blockade the hyperlanes. Do whatever you have to do to make sure none of your survey ships, none of your mining fleets, and none of your tourists ever accidentally wander into our backyard." Simon let go of the podium. He took a step back. "Because right now," he said, the cynical exhaustion settling deep into his bones, "we are busy fighting each other. We are distracted. But if you give us a common enemy, if you give us a reason to look up at the stars and decide that we hate you more than we hate ourselves," Simon shook his head slowly, "you won't have to worry about us reverse engineering your hyperdrives. We'll build our own, and we will come looking for you. Not to conquer, not to rule." Simon felt a cold, dark smile touch the corner of his lips, a smile he didn't entirely want to make, but one that felt undeniably, violently human. "But to make sure you burn with us." The silence that descended on the Galactic Council this time wasn't born of shock. It was born of absolute, crystalline understanding. They saw the sheer, jagged edge of the human soul laid bare, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. Richard swallowed, a heavy, visible movement of his throat. He raised his gavel. His hand was shaking. "The motion to permanently quarantine the Sol system is proposed," Richard stammered, his voice stripped of all its former grandeur. "All in favor?" Every single light on the delegate boards flashed a brilliant, frantic green. There was no debate. There were no abstentions. It was a unanimous, desperate slam of the door. "Passed," Richard whispered. He didn't even strike the gavel. He just set it down gently, as if afraid a sudden noise might set the human off. "This session is concluded. Representative Simon, you will be escorted to your ship. You are expelled from council space. Forever." "Thank you," Simon said. He meant it. He turned around and walked back across the massive, polished floor. Squeak! Squeak! The sound followed him all the way to the heavy platinum doors. The hydraulic seals hissed, parting to let him out. Simon stepped into the harsh, white light of the orbital docking corridor. The doors sealed shut behind him with a heavy, final thud. He stood alone in the hallway. He reached up, pulled the translating earpiece from his ear, and crushed it under the heel of his shoe. The low, agonizing D-flat hum vanished, replaced by the beautiful, empty silence of the station. Simon loosened his tie, unbuttoned his chafing collar, and let out a long, ragged sigh. He looked out the massive viewport at the sprawling tapestry of the galaxy, millions of stars, billions of worlds, all safe behind their quarantine lines. He was going home to a broken, battered, bleeding world, a mud ball filled with spiteful, angry apes. Simon pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the viewport, closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't wait to get back to the mud. Do you love deeply grounded, gritty sci-fi where humanity wins not through advanced technology, but through sheer, unyielding stubbornness? If this story of Earth's messy, brutal, and uniquely human defense gave you chills, hit that like button. Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below. How would you survive an alien invasion? See you next time.